The Cater House estate in Buffalo sounds like it has quite a dark history, especially with the tragic story of the sheriff's suicide following the foreclosure. Older estates with tales of personal tragedy often become centers for local legends, and in this case, the sheriff's story may add a strong emotional imprint on the location. The voices locals claim to hear could be tied to this sad history, almost as if residual energy remains, echoing past events. In folklore, it's often said that places bearing intense emotions, especially those with abrupt or unresolved endings, may hold onto traces of the past. Do you know if people have tried to investigate or document the voices? Or if there have been any reports of other unusual sightings or sensations at the estate? As twilight fell over Buffalo, the Cater House estate stood silhouetted against the deepening sky, its windows like dark, hollow eyes watching over the town. Despite years of neglect, the mansion loomed as grand as it had been in the sheriff's day, albeit cloaked in mystery and a lingering sadness. Its once bustling halls were now silent, but the locals swore that silence was never what it seemed. Jessie Miller had heard the stories since she was a child. The sheriff, distraught after losing his beloved estate, had taken his own life in one of the mansion's upper rooms. Some said his spirit still lingered, but others claimed there was something older within the walls, a force that had perhaps driven him to despair. Jessie had never believed in such tales, but when she inherited a small portion of the property through an eccentric Greytant's will, curiosity got the best of her. She waited for her friend, Mark, at the iron gates, which creaked as she pushed them open. The path to the house was overgrown, and as she walked, she could feel something strange in the air, a static heaviness, like the charged silence before a storm. Mark arrived, flashlight in hand, and they exchanged nervous smiles before heading inside. The grand entryway yawned before them, dimly lit by fading daylight filtering through dusty windows. They made their way deeper into the house, their footsteps echoing against the walls as they whispered nervously to each other about the sheriff's story. It wasn't until they reached the second floor that they heard it, the unmistakable murmur of voices. It was faint at first, like a faraway radio struggling to tune in. Jessie froze, her heart racing as she glanced at Mark, who looked equally unnerved. "Maybe it's just an old house settling," he whispered, but his voice was unconvincing, wavering as the sounds grew louder. The voices seemed to come from the master bedroom at the end of the hall. Every instinct told them to turn back, but an unseen force pulled them forward, compelling them to move closer. Jessie reached for the doorknob, hesitating before pushing the door open. Inside, the room was almost entirely bare, save for a single mirror mounted on the far wall, its glass clouded with age. But in the mirror's reflection they saw a figure. A man standing near the window, staring out into the night. His outline was shadowed, blending with the room's darkness, yet his presence was undeniable. Jessie's breath hitched as she caught sight of his face in the glass. Pale, with hollow eyes fixed on something beyond the window. His figure was indistinct, almost translucent, but there was a chilling intensity to his expression, as if he were lost in a memory or perhaps waiting. Mark whispered her name, snapping her out of the trance. She turned to him, but when she looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, the silence pressing in around them. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice barely more than a breath. "Yeah," Mark replied, his voice shaky. "But maybe we should get out of here." Jessie nodded, but something in the room held her there. Her eyes fell on the mirror again. This time, the glass wasn't empty. Letters were etched across its surface, as if scratched from the inside. "Help Emmy." A chill ran down her spine. She reached out, her fingertips grazing the glass, feeling its unnatural coldness. In that moment, the voices returned, louder and clearer than before. The murmurs overlapped, rising in intensity until she could make out a phrase. "He did it. He did it." The words repeated, insistent and desperate. Mark tugged her arm. "Jessie, we need to go." But the door behind them suddenly slammed shut, and a gust of frigid air swept through the room. Jessie felt her skin prickle, as if an icy hand had brushed across her neck. She looked around, trying to find the source, but the air was empty. Just as panic set in, they heard footsteps echoing from the hallway outside, slow and heavy, pacing back and forth as if someone or something was standing guard. Mark reached for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside. They stood frozen, watching the handle turn ever so slightly, as though testing the resistance. Jessie's pulse hammered in her ears, and she swallowed back a scream. Suddenly, the mirror fogged up again, and new words appeared beneath the original message. This time they read, "It wasn't me. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story." Jessie stared at the mirror, her mind reeling. The words on the glass twisted something deep inside her. A sense of betrayal, confusion, maybe even fear. Whoever or whatever was trying to reach them was struggling against something larger, some darker truth buried within the walls of the Cater house. The footsteps outside the door resumed, pacing back and forth, heavier now, with an edge of impatience. Mark pounded on the door in frustration, but it was as if the house had locked them in, unwilling to let them leave until its story was told. "Do you think it's the sheriff?" he whispered, his face pale in the dim light. Jessie shook her head. "I don't know, but it feels like someone else." She couldn't shake the feeling that the sheriff was only one part of the puzzle, like he was merely a pawn caught in a game far beyond his control. There was something more, something that had driven him to the brink, and it was still here. The voices returned, but this time, they were different, angry, frantic. It sounded like a woman, her tone laced with desperation. Words began to form through the whispers, phrases like "hidden" and "he lied." Jessie strained to listen, picking out a name, Thomas. The voice repeated it, each time more urgent, as if she was pleading for him to hear. "Who's Thomas?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jessie looked around the room, eyes scanning for anything that might hold a clue. Her gaze landed on a dusty ledger lying on a side table, untouched for years. She picked it up, brushing off the cobwebs. Inside, the pages were filled with the sheriff's handwriting, lists of debts, payments, and notes. But near the end, the handwriting changed, becoming more erratic. The last few pages were a scrawl of half-finished words and broken sentences. One phrase stood out among the chaos: "Thomas knows." Thomas was there. A shiver ran down her spine. The sheriff had kept secrets of his own, and it seemed someone or something was desperate to expose them. Mark stepped back, his face pale, his voice barely a whisper. "Jessie, what if Thomas isn't just a name? What if he's still here?" As if on cue, the cold intensified, and the whispers became more pronounced, filling the room with a wave of anguish. The words on the mirror shifted again, this time spelling out, "Find it." Just then, the walls themselves seemed to hum, as if the entire house were alive and listening. From somewhere deep within, a faint, rhythmic thudding began. A heartbeat, slow and deliberate. It seemed to come from the floor below, as if guiding them toward something buried in the heart of the house. Jessie's eyes met Mark's, and she could see her own fear mirrored in his gaze. They both knew there was no turning back now. The thudding sound beneath them was hypnotic, almost pulling Jessie and Mark forward as they made their way down the narrow staircase. Shadows seemed to stretch and flicker along the walls, twisting into strange shapes that danced in the corner of their vision. The air grew colder, thick with an indescribable tension, as if they were descending into the very soul of the Cater house. The noise led them to a small, forgotten door in the far corner of the first-floor hallway, concealed behind layers of peeling wallpaper. It looked like no one had opened it in decades. Jessie reached out, hesitating before gripping the rusty handle. The door groaned as it swung open, revealing a set of steep, stone steps descending into darkness. Mark flicked on his flashlight, illuminating the rough stone walls as they ventured down, step by cautious step. The air was stale, carrying the scent of damp earth and something metallic, like old blood. At the bottom, they found themselves in a cramped basement room filled with dust-covered furniture, cobweb trunks, and stacks of forgotten boxes. But at the room's center stood a large, imposing wardrobe, its once polished surface now dull and scratched. as if something had clawed at it over the years. A chill ran through Jessie as she felt an overwhelming sense of dread emanating from it. "Do you think it's in there?" Mark asked, his voice barely audible, as if speaking too loudly might wake something. Jessie nodded, though every instinct screamed for her to turn back. Slowly, she approached the wardrobe, her hand trembling as she reached for its brass handle. She pulled the doors open, and the scent of decay wafted out, stale and bitter. Inside was a collection of old, moth-eaten coats and scarves, hanging limply in the dim light. But something else was tucked away at the bottom. A small, locked chest, its lid scratched with faint symbols Jessie couldn't quite decipher. She crouched down, trying to pry it open, but it wouldn't budge. "What now?" Mark whispered, glancing around nervously. As if in answer, the voices began again, louder this time, filling the basement with frantic whispers. One voice, a deep male tone, broke through the cacophony, clear and commanding, behind the wall. Jessie's heart pounded as she looked up, scanning the walls until she noticed a faint crack in the stone near the wardrobe. She ran her fingers along it, feeling the rough edges, and pushed. A section of the wall shifted, revealing a small alcove carved into the stone, just large enough to hold a single object. Inside lay a dusty, leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with the initials TS. She opened it carefully, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the brittle pages. The entries were scrawled in hurried, frantic handwriting, detailing the sheriff's descent into paranoia. He wrote about Thomas, about his suspicions, his fear that something dark was lurking within the house. And then one final, scrawled entry, barely legible. "The truth is here, hidden where they'll never find it. She won't stop until I pay for what I've done." Before Jessie could read further, a sound erupted from the wardrobe behind them, a guttural, angry groan, as if something long dormant had been disturbed. She turned, eyes wide with horror, just as the basement lights flickered and the temperature dropped even further. The shadows seemed to pulse, inching toward them, coalescing into a figure, a man, his face twisted with rage, his form flickering in and out of the darkness. He pointed a ghostly finger at Jessie, his mouth opening in a silent scream, but she understood his words clearly in her mind. "You shouldn't have come here." Jessie staggered back, the force of the silent accusation striking her like a physical blow. The ghostly figure's eyes burned with a piercing intensity, a bottomless anger tempered by deep, unending sorrow. Mark grabbed her arm, his grip tight, and they both stumbled toward the stairs. But as they turned, the cellar door at the top of the stairs slammed shut with a deafening thud. Panic surged through them as the temperature plummeted, their breath now visible in icy clouds. The figure's form wavered, twisting into something darker, more fractured. In the dim light of Mark's trembling flashlight, it almost looked like pieces of other faces were embedded in its own. A woman's anguished eyes, a young child's open mouth, a mosaic of tortured souls, fused together as one. And then, a voice echoed within the basement, not from the specter but from all around them, resonating within the walls, the very stones. It was faint at first but grew clearer, the voice of a woman pleading, "Find the ledger." He hid the ledger. Jessie's mind raced. They had seen the ledger upstairs, but they hadn't looked through every page. "Mark," she gasped, her voice shaking, "the ledger. We missed something. There might be more." Mark nodded, his eyes wide with understanding, and they turned back toward the journal and the chest. But before they could reach it, the shadowy figure moved in front of them, its form stretching unnaturally across the floor and walls, blocking their path. Its hollow eyes bore into them, and for a moment, Jessie felt the weight of memories not her own. A flash of violence, of a bitter argument, of secrets whispered in dark corners. Suddenly, the figure's voice, distorted and low, filled the room, crackling with fury and despair. She wasn't supposed to know. No one was supposed to know. The figure moved closer, its form shifting like smoke, dissolving and reforming, as if struggling to maintain shape. Mark's flashlight flickered and then died, plunging the basement into absolute darkness. The oppressive silence returned, broken only by the faint rustling of paper as the pages of the sheriff's journal turned on their own, stopping on the final, scrawled entry. The words glowed faintly, just enough for Jessie to make them out in the dark. I locked her truth away, buried it deep. They must never find it. Just as the words faded, there was a faint scratching sound behind them, like fingernails scraping against stone. Jessie turned slowly, her heart hammering, and saw that the wall beside the wardrobe was crumbling, revealing an even smaller cavity within. Something was embedded in the stone, a hidden drawer, wedged so tightly it looked as though it hadn't been opened in centuries. Jessie reached for it, her fingers scraping against the rough stone, and tugged it free. Inside lay another journal, this one even older, its cover embossed with a single name, Lillian. The air grew impossibly colder, the ghostly figure shrinking back into the shadows as Jessie opened the journal. She and Mark leaned in close, reading the delicate script that filled the pages, entries that revealed secrets darker than they could have imagined. Lillian had been the sheriff's wife, but she'd known about Thomas, about the debts, about the desperate lengths her husband would go to keep his reputation intact. The final entry read, "If he comes for me, the truth will remain. If you find this, you will know." Before they could read further, a sudden, guttural scream erupted from the figure, filling the basement with its fury. The scream reverberated through the basement, rattling the walls and shaking dust from the ceiling beams. Jessie clutched the journal tightly to her chest, feeling the pulse of energy radiating from it as if Lillian herself were pleading through the pages. Mark backed toward the stairs, pulling Jessie with him, but the figure seemed to loom larger, twisting and contorting as if torn between anger and sorrow, bound by some invisible chain to the room. From behind them came a new sound, a low, grinding creak. They turned, watching as the ancient wardrobe began to shift, slowly sliding across the floor as though moved by an unseen force. Beneath it, another hidden compartment was revealed, a small trapdoor with iron hinges, its wood warped and splintered with age. The thudding heartbeat they'd heard earlier grew louder, coming from whatever lay below. Jessie's pulse quickened as she dropped to her knees, pulling open the trapdoor. The air that rushed out was frigid and thick with the scent of earth and rot. She held the flashlight over the opening, revealing a narrow tunnel carved into the ground, leading even deeper beneath the house. Mark looked down at it, his face pale, his voice barely steady. "How far down does this go?" "I don't know," Jessie whispered, but a strange resolve filled her as she glanced back at the shadowy figure, now hovering at the far end of the room, watching her with an intensity that seemed almost pleading. She realized with a start that this figure wasn't trying to stop them, it was guiding them. Lillian's truth, the sheriff's secrets, they were hidden down there, waiting to be uncovered. Together, they climbed down into the tunnel, the walls closing in around them as they moved forward. The tunnel twisted and turned, a labyrinth of darkness and silence. The heartbeat grew louder, steady and insistent, until finally, they emerged into a small chamber lined with rough-hewn stones. At the center of the room lay an ancient chest, its wood blackened with age, the metal clasp marked with the same strange symbols that had been etched into the sheriff's journal. Jessie's hand shook as she reached forward, grasping the icy handle, feeling as if the entire house was holding its breath, waiting. With a creak, the chest opened, revealing a collection of papers bound with a brittle leather cord. She untied it, her fingers numb as she unfurled the top page, revealing a confession written in the sheriff's jagged handwriting, each line a desperate plea. The confession revealed debts, betrayals, and a brutal betrayal of Lillian herself. He had silenced her, ensuring she could never speak the truth of his dealings, leaving her spirit bound to the house for eternity. But there was more. Behind the confession lay another letter, this one in delicate, flowing handwriting Lillian's. In her final words, she had cursed him, vowing that his secrets would haunt him, that his legacy would rot with him beneath the house. Mark took a step back, horror etched on his face. "Jessie, it's her. She's still here. She wanted us to find this." As they looked back, the ghostly figure had reappeared, now transformed. No longer a shadow, the figure of a woman stood before them, her face a mixture of sorrow and relief. Lillian reached out, her hand hovering over Jessie's, her spectral touch sending a cold tingle through her skin. And then, with a gentle but powerful whisper that seemed to echo from the depths of the house itself, Lillian's voice filled Jessie's mind. "You freed me." With that, the figure faded, dissolving into a shimmering mist that drifted upward, disappearing into the cracks of the stone ceiling above. As the mist vanished, a profound stillness settled over the chamber. Jessie and Mark stood in silence, feeling the weight of centuries lift, the oppressive cold finally fading. The heartbeat stopped, leaving only a calm, almost warm presence behind, as if the house itself had exhaled. They climbed back up through the tunnel and out of the basement, guided by an unspoken understanding that Lillian's spirit was finally at peace. Once outside, they looked back at the Cater house, its looming presence softened in the moonlight. The shadows that had once felt menacing now seemed restful, as if the estate had finally let go of its painful secrets. Jessie squeezed Mark's hand, and they walked away, leaving the Cater house to its long overdue silence. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.